Welcome to all of you out in the Bosshole Transformation Nation. And by the way, the Bosshole Transformation Nation is growing significantly. We'd like to thank all of our listeners, all of our followers who continue to share and promote the Bosshole Chronicles. They tell their colleagues, their friends about it. And it is just so wonderful to have all our new listeners joining us. We invite you to provide feedback, follow us. We hope you're getting everything out of the podcast that we are putting into it. Today, I actually have the pleasure of introducing you to Mr. Roy Getz. Now, I had the opportunity to meet Roy last year, shortly after we moved to the Columbus area. He and I met through LinkedIn. He was gracious enough to say, hey, let's grab some coffee, get to know each other. And what I learned, this is an individual who has an amazing background. Real deep leadership development background via the food service and hospitality industries. He is still considered a subject matter expert in those areas. But Roy's primary work is as an EOS implementer, and most of us know EOS as the Entrepreneurial Operating System, which is a platform that helps business owners and entrepreneurs leverage their systems, processes, their people, and apply proven tactics and models to help just move their business forward and move it to a whole new level. And sometimes his work is to help them get unstuck. So let's meet Mr. Roy Getz. The Bosshole Chronicles are brought to you by Real Good Ventures, a talent optimization firm helping organizations diagnose their most critical people and execution issues with world-class analytics. Make sure to check out all the resources in the show notes and be sure to follow us and share your feedback. Enjoy today's episode. Roy, it is so good to have you here on the Bosshole Chronicles. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You and I had a chance to meet, I think it was this past summer, and our paths crossed and we had a chance to sit down with coffee, and you were very gracious and just, welcoming me to the Central Ohio area. But I realized early on in our conversations that this was a kindred spirit. Your background in the food service industry, hospitality, your work with leaders and entrepreneurs. I'm just excited that our listeners are going to get to hear more about what you're seeing and what they can take away by keeping their fingers on the pulse of what's happening today, because there's a lot happening today, isn't there?
There absolutely is. And by the way, I feel the same way. You're a kindred spirit, and it's amazing all the different topics that we were able to get into. But I'm very excited to be here today and to be able to talk about some of those for sure.
Well, let's start off by, you have such a considerable experience working with business owners, obviously as an EOS implementer, but even outside of that too. What are you seeing right now when it comes to companies? The big issue that we're facing with a lot of our organizations is retention, engagement, and performance, but retention is a major one. You've got a really interesting perspective on what the mistakes that companies may be making when it comes to retaining people. They may be looking at the wrong stuff. What can you share with our audience about that?
I think you're right about that. I think what's challenging, and as I talk to all of these leadership teams, I see these common themes come up. And right now, everybody is challenged with both finding great employees and retaining great employees. And as they start really thinking about how are we going to retain those employees, I see time and time again that they're going after the wrong things. And I shouldn't say the wrong things, because it's certainly important to make sure we've got the right benefits and we've got PTO and we've got, health benefits and all those important things, and looking at compensation. You got to do all that stuff. But then the work's not done. I call that the easy stuff. Those are decisions that we can make. And I don't want to underestimate how challenging it is to make further investments in that. So I'm not minimizing that.
Right.
But you can make a decision, you can make the investment, you can see it on a piece of paper, and you can, if you want to, you can kind of put your hands together and say, okay, it's done. And I'm seeing that continually. And what I'm telling folks is, folks, we've got to do the more challenging stuff to engage our workforce. We've got to open the lines of communication. It's hard when we're managing and leading human beings. This is the hard part of getting them into meaningful conversations. There's a lot going on in society and in people's social media streams right now that is drawing them into places where they they want their own balance that they're looking for, and they see opportunities to not engage or to not take on more responsibility or to not be in meetings and engage the way we think we would like them to be. And I see business owners and leaders oftentimes getting frustrated with that, not understanding that, and not putting the culture, the systems, and the processes in place to get that valuable dialogue going with their employees, whether it starts as an employee survey that some of my folks are doing, whether it starts with regular meetings. We talk in our business about a meeting pulse and making sure that we're consistently getting feedback. So it's not just ad hoc.
Right.
It's you've got to have a process in place so that you're getting that dialogue going between management and between the employees that they're working with.
Roy, when you talk about feedback, and we like to say at Real Good Ventures that feedback is the oxygen of engagement. Oftentimes, I think managers or business owners think that, well, in my position, I have to give feedback. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about, soliciting feedback. I mean, I would imagine that is a change of perspective. And how are you coaching and guiding your clients to become more on the receiving end of feedback versus the giving end of feedback?
That's a great setup for the thought that I've got right now, which is each of my teams that we talk to, we're trying to help them to understand that it starts with an openness and a vulnerability, right? We talk about open and honest all the time. And we all say that, and we can all say in this meeting, we all want to be open and honest. But what I tell them is, first of all, open means you have to be open-minded. You have to really listen to what that other person is saying. And since we're human beings, when we hear something that we don't agree with, the rebuttal engine starts in our heads. And we're like, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. And now all of a sudden, you're not really hearing somebody because you're already projecting exactly what it is that you want to, like you said, what you want to tell them, what direction you want to give them. So we really work hard on we've got to be open-minded. And then the other part of it is we really work on we have to be honest with that person if we don't agree with what they're saying. So many times we have this thing, it's in Ohio, it's called Midwestern nice, which means we have somebody that really needs to have a crucial conversation, radical candor, something that's really important that we've got to talk about that is affecting either our relationship or it's impeding our ability to move forward as a business. And some of my leaders, my business owners, these are folks that think all of these things.
Right.
They have a hard time articulating it. And so we're talking to them all the time. If you're feeling it, you've got to say it, not in an unkind way. It's got to be in a respectful way. Because if you don't, you know how it comes out. It comes out later on down the road as this bluster of anger and frustration instead of a constructive, what I call a nutritious, meaningful conversation.
You're reminding me of Sarah, my partner. One of the things she says as part of her, and she's borrowed this from somebody else, but one of the things she says is, mean what you say what you mean, but don't say it mean.
That's right.
You also remind me of a recent guest on the podcast, Dr. Stephen Tang. His book just published this week, as a matter of fact. You talk about Midwestern nice. He referred to something called toxic positivity versus tragic optimism, especially in times of crisis, like with the pandemic. But it made me think of that positivity while you may be thinking, or niceness, maybe like we're helping somebody, but in reality, we're only compounding the problem, where we need to be very transparent and honest, but, speak the truth in love, but just speak the truth. And that goes a long way for sure. And that's inherent, though, in the work you do with EOS. I mean, in how you help to guide your teams, is it not?
Yeah. And to the point that you're making, one of the things that we talk about is the most respectful thing you can do is to share with somebody where you're not aligned with their performance, where you're not aligned with their alignment to core values, or whatever aspect of their work that you're not satisfied with. Because you know what happens? You have a bunch of leadership team members sitting in a room talking about others in the organization that they're dissatisfied with, and those other people don't know it. Yeah. They right. And so part of what I do, to your point, the work that I do as a coach and using the EOS tools,
Right.
I'm constantly telling those leadership team members, okay, I'm your accountability coach. We've identified who the people issue is. We've identified what the issue is. We've identified the supervisor who owns the issue. Now, when are you going to fix the issue?
Mm-hmm.
You going to just keep talking about it?
Right.
And that's when they get squirrely in their seats. They're like, wait a minute. He's like telling us he's telling us we got to solve it. And I look at him, I say, I'm not giving you the date because I'm not in the business, but you have to pick a date.
Right.
Doesn't matter if it's a week, a month, 30 days, 90 days, a year, whatever it is. But you guys have been talking about this for 5 years.
Yeah.
I had a company that had a underperforming multi-unit operator that had been in position for 7 years, and everybody on the leadership team agreed that this person was no good and they had to go. 7 years.
And nothing.
Like, when are you going to have does the guy even know that you're this dissatisfied with it? Right?
How painful does it need to become before you actually do that? Yeah. And radical candor, Kim Scott, she's actually been on the podcast. I mean, if you can't in kindness and with civility, at least be truthful with people. I mean, it's helping no one. But don't you find that to a degree, and something else, Roy, that I've noticed and that you've shared with me? I mean, number one, companies got to stop doing the easy stuff or taking the easy road and really, chop that wood. Go for the stuff that is challenging, that is meaningful to the people-centric stuff. But you also talk about letting go. In other words, and we see this a lot, that there are organizations, company leaders that are holding on to old mental models or an old framework. Tell our listeners what you mean when you think about helping your clients let go.
Letting go is perhaps one of the greatest challenges that my leaders have. And when I say leaders, this can be somebody who is managing others and they're just months into being a supervisor, all the way up to somebody that I'm thinking of that has had more than 30 years managing human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And here's what they all have a challenge with. We give it a label. I give it a label. It's really, how do you successfully delegate and elevate yourself to your unique abilities?
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about that with my groups in my very first session with them, and everybody nods their head and says, yeah. And then we get to the second session and I push a little bit more and I say, okay, now let's talk about delegation. How many times have you been in a situation where you feel overworked and overtaxed, and yet you have some task that somebody that's working for you is supposed to do, but they're not doing it? And you say something like, well, if I want it done right, I got to do it myself. Mm-hmm. Or you say, if I want it done on time, then I got to do it myself. Or you say, if I want it done at all, I've got to do it myself. Right. And if you have 5 people working with you and you do that with 5 different things through the course of the day or week, you're sitting there as a leader, as a manager, highly frustrated. Mm-hmm. And even to some point, I run into teams where there is this angst and almost an antagonistic relationship with their employees. Because like, I wish they would do this stuff.
Right.
But it goes back to the conversation we just had, which is they don't tell them that.
Right.
They don't tell them. And so the part of the coaching piece that goes with this is, one of the things that I do is, as we work on the structure of the organization, I teach my leaders to sit down with somebody that works for them and go through their function and say, these are the 5 critical roles of your job. It's not a job description, but it's the 5 critical roles. And here's what often happens. The first time they sit down with them and they tell their employee, okay, these are your 5 most important roles, it's not uncommon for that employee to go, well, that 5th role, boss, you do that all the time. I thought that was your job. Yeah. And the supervisor sit there and go, no, I've been doing it because you couldn't do it. Right. I expected you to do that 5th thing. And now you've got this open, honest, nutritious dialogue. And both of them are looking at each other going, our expectations were completely misaligned on this. Yeah. And that's the first part of having just a realistic conversation about freeing yourself up so you can have a life. Some of this stuff we talk about, John, is life-changing for supervisors because they thought part of their job was to work as hard as possible to get all of this stuff done. But then they don't realize that they're working 70 hours a week and their employees are walking out the door at 5:00. Right. Right. And they get resentful. They get resentful for that. That's right. Resentful. Yep. And they have to realize that everything that happens in that organization below them is their fault. Mm-hmm. And as a coach, when you look at them and you tell them that, I've had people look like they're almost going to cry. They're like, what do you mean it's my fault? It's them. They're not doing their job. If they're not doing their job, either you're not training them, you're not holding them accountable, or you're not respectfully removing them.
Yes.
That's all your fault. And that's a hard thing for any experienced or inexperienced supervisor who's managing human beings to get their head wrapped around.
Well, and to your point earlier, before we hit record, that is all wrapped around or wrapped within the idea of establishing trust and empowering people to do the job they've been hired to do, and being able to step back and allow them to do it, and even fail safely, and create an environment where people can grow. Because otherwise, as it's so obvious, if we're doing it for them, there is no growth, there's no development, and that's what managers need to be doing.
Yeah, I really think that you're onto something. That to me is the cream that rises to the top when organizations, when leaders can create that psychological safety. And that's really what you're talking about, because the cultures that don't create that, and I see them, they can't seem to get to that point where they allow themselves to be, as leaders, vulnerable, right?
Right.
And so it's very top down. We lay out expectations. We're very clear on the expectations, Roy. We told them what they need to do, but there's not a two-way dialogue that exists.
Mm-hmm.
And psychological safety is kind of a fancy term, but it's really being able to have a meeting with the people that work with you and for you. And if you have a point of view that you're, quote, thinking of as direction, and they have a point of view that's contrary to that, you've got to allow yourself, based with new information and possibly better information from somebody that's like in the field,
right,
to change your direction from time to time.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about being wishy-washy, but if I only have partial information and I'm getting ready to send my sales force off for a task, and they come back and say, look, boss, this isn't going to happen, and that's going to happen, this is going to be way too expensive, can we do it this way? Do you have any idea how powerful it is to go,
yeah,
I really hadn't thought about it like that. Let's do it that way and see how
test
it goes.
It out. Absolutely.
Even if it's going to fail, let's try that. And sometimes leaders feel that characterizes them as a weak leader because they're operating off of some old failed model that doesn't recognize that really the willingness to listen, the willingness to be flexible based on facts, is a strength in a leader, not a weakness.
And we will be right back.
With employee disengagement at its highest level in 9 years, your company can't afford to miss the mark when it comes to optimizing your hiring, management, and team performance practices. At its lowest level, employee turnover costs you $11,000 per person. And those are dollars you can easily save with the right set of people analytics. Real Good Ventures is a talent optimization consultancy specializing in world-class analytics specific to your people and the critical role they play within your organization. Gain confidence in your hiring practices, keep the boss holes from driving your talent away, design your teams for flawless execution, and create a culture that offers meaning and fulfillment. Real Good Ventures has a family of validated diagnostic tools specific to the human aspect of business, because we know that all business issues are people issues. Visit us today at www.realgoodventures.com and bring meaning and fulfillment back into your workplace.
Okay, let's get back to the program. And our audience is familiar with psychological safety because we've had Dr. Amy Edmondson on here. We have a platform, we have a tool where we can diagnose it for a team, but it's often misunderstood that psychological safety is not just the responsibility of the leader, the team leader. It's threefold. It's the leader obviously helps to either create or diminish psychological safety, but it's also the responsibility or accountability of the team members themselves. And then the environmental context, sort of the culture. I mean, how do we destigmatize failure? Do we allow people to fail, successfully, and encourage challenge to the status quo? Or as you're saying, hey, I've got a different direction for this, and I'd really like to bring it to your attention. And that is welcome. That is one of those things where ultimately psychological safety is about performance. I think some people think it's about feeling good, and it's not. It's literally about team performance. I think that when you start to talk about things like focusing on the people-centered development, the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit of benefits and comp and all that other stuff. I mean, statistically, we've known for years that when it comes to engagement and retention and people wanting to be part of an organization, it's not nothing, but it's certainly not at the top of the list. The people-focused stuff is. And then part of that, to your point, Roy, is how do we create that trust? How do we empower people and equip them? But also, to your point, I need to break some of my old habits. I mean, my desire to jump in, I think you and I were similar in that if we weren't adapting to our natural styles, we could very easily jump in and take something over. I mean, I just think that that's how we're wired, but we've had to learn about that. And when you can create that psychological safety, that's when things really, really change. But it is work. It is absolutely work.
It is. And you reminded me of something. I think I'm thinking of an example. So we do tend to focus, again, to remind you, I work with leadership teams. So an owner of small companies, leadership teams, and we talk through all these concepts. And we oftentimes do talk about the impact of the leader. Oftentimes he's the president or the CEO, the owner of the business.
Right.
And when you own a business, nobody holds you accountable. I mean, you can make mistakes all over the place. And the worst thing that happens to you is, I guess, ultimately you could go out of business, or you could lose some people, but there really is no level of accountability. Most of my companies don't have boards in place or advisory boards. So I become the accountability coach.
Right.
So we're in a meeting, and oftentimes I'm focusing on helping the leader to understand, well, hang on, you got to be the last person to speak. Can we let all these other people speak? And that immediately encourages participation, because there's folks sitting there going, well, I didn't know you could talk to John like that. Roy just kind of shut him down, right? And so the point that I'm wanting to make is that while a lot of my work is with that leader, the bigger part of my work is with the team members who oftentimes will complain in some shape or version that they're shut down and that they don't have a voice. But to your point, it's on them when they now see a leader who wants their voice, invites them to be of counsel, wants their feedback, a facilitator like me that is seeking their feedback. And you know what they do, John? They sit there in silence. Not always, but oftentimes it's the ones that want to have this environment. And here's the truth that I tell them. Again, I always start off with, I'm the guy that's going to tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. I could walk out of here and get fired tomorrow because I'm about to tell you something you guys got to hear.
Sure.
And I look at all of them and I say, this has to go both ways. If you want engagement, you got to bring it. And frankly, if you can't bring it, if you feel uncomfortable bringing it, you shouldn't be sitting around the leadership team table.
That's a good point.
And I just let that pause for a second, and I just stare at everybody, and folks are looking at each other like, did he just say we got to earn our right to be around the leadership table? And it's really not that blunt, but I really kind of want to sort of verbally shake them and help them to understand that you're here for a reason.
Right.
You're leading the finance or the marketing or the operations or the HR department as part of this leadership team because you have knowledge and skill and value for this organization. And you must engage even in the face of a leader who oftentimes they're very forceful, they're opinionated, they're passionate. They just want somebody that's going to debate with them. They don't want to fire anybody. They just want a friendly debate. And if they don't have somebody on their leadership team that will work with them to end up with a better product, typically what happens in my engagements is a year and a half after we start, the leadership team changes. It's made up of different people because they've got, and not necessarily terminated. We just find another seat for them in the organization because it just might not be that leadership is their thing. They're in there because they've put in the most time, or they're the most senior, or they're a family member. I do a lot of family businesses. Sometimes people on the leadership team because they have partial ownership when the truth is they'd be just great salespeople out in the field. Just let them go and sell. And It's hard for the dad to tell his kid that he shouldn't be on the leadership team. I can do that. I'll just say it, right?
Yeah.
And so you're just so right about that dynamic of creating dialogue and psychological safety is incumbent on both the most senior leader and the rest of the leaders, the rest of the managers in an organization.
No doubt. No doubt. Well, Roy, let me ask you just as we start to wrap up, our listeners would love to hear, just given the breadth of your experience, the work that you do, what are you seeing around the corner? I mean, if you could speak to our small business owners or any business owner or senior leader, if you could give them one really key piece of advice as this year unfolds even further, what would that be?
Solidify the basics.
Okay.
It doesn't sound sexy. It does. Everybody might kind of roll their eyes and goes, yeah, whatever. but I consistently see my business owners, my leadership teams going after something that either is unclear to them or they don't know, and they've not yet shored up the basics.
Okay.
That old cliche about you've got to have a strong foundation. It can't be built on sand before you go on to higher levels and do other things. I think that is always important.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm seeing in all of my businesses, and it doesn't matter whether it's a crane manufacturer, an architectural firm, a marketing firm, a computer firm. I mean, I work with all different industries all across the board, because what I work on is enterprise management. We're right. Industry agnostic. And what I'm seeing across the board is uncertainty. And it's uncertainty. It's different from every company. Sometimes it is around supply chain. Sometimes it is around management, or sometimes it's around lack of good people, whatever that might be. But they've got to make sure that they shore up the basics. They've got to have their systems in place. And everything you talk about, everything that I learned from you, it really is around your team and your culture. Mm-hmm. And if you really create an enduring, safe, powerful, nurturing culture, you're going to be able to withstand people trying to poach your people. Yeah. You're going to be able to withstand some potential headwinds that are coming from a business standpoint, because your people are going to be in there rowing in the same direction with you and being willing to slug it out, versus chasing lots of shiny stuff that can just do nothing but get my teams and my ownership groups distracted. We saw it through the pandemic. All of my leaders will tell you that they completely misunderstood who their key people were. When you're in the midst of a pandemic, and you've probably heard this before, they looked around the room and they went, well, I had no idea that Joe and Sarah and Billy were like every day in the trenches. They're just doing everything that they need to help this company survive. And the folks that they thought were their heroes and their superstars, they were running for the hills. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of my teams now have, because of that pandemic, solidified their teams. They know who their top people are. They're wanting to make sure they don't lose them. And they're going to be really well served to work on the basics for at least the next 12 months.
And those basics, those foundational variables, if in place, are absolutely going to help them withstand whatever's next. And there is going to be a next. Hopefully it's not a pandemic, but we've told people if the pandemic did nothing else, it exposed a real vulnerability in management capabilities and leadership. And all people wanted at that point is stabilization. I mean, I've got to know that my life, everything is disrupted, but there has to be some stabilization. And your advice is get those basics in place.
Let me say something. You're right. Yeah. You're right. And let me say something too, because I can say basics and everybody's got their own interpretation. I'll give you one example.
Yeah.
So when I say basics, what I say is make sure that your best people, you're doing everything that you need to do to keep them and the communication going. So for instance, we work through all of the tools that we use, and we often identify the challenges that we have with what I call the knuckleheads, but we don't spend any time on our heroes. And I tell my teams, sit here and think about the person that is the most valuable to your organization, your number 2 in your department, your go-to person, and imagine them tomorrow putting in their 2-week notice. What do you do?
Yeah. And
some of them sit there and they start literally sweating and going, God, if John left, I'd be working 80 hours a week. And I said, so when's the last time you had a conversation with them and gave them some professional development? I'm not talking about throwing money at them.
Right.
Spend time with them, encourage them, make sure they know they're important, bring them in on important decisions. Whatever you can do to engage with them, that to me is a fundamental. The other fundamental is we have a huge disparity between leadership and middle management. We are not teaching our middle managers how to middle manage. We're treating them like employees.
Yes.
And if we don't spend time having conversations with them like we're having now and introducing guys like you and the tools, we're just going to be completely at risk to handle some of these headwinds that are coming our way, because strong middle management makes the difference.
Absolutely. Amen. Oh, Roy, that's great. That is so great. Well, listen, everybody out there. Well, first of all, Roy, thank you so much. We really appreciate the time sharing your insights and perspective on the Bosshole Chronicles. I look forward to our next coffee. And I just want to remind our listeners, go to the show notes. We will have his LinkedIn and EOS link in the show notes. Go check him out. Great guy. And Roy, it's wonderful. And let's check in real soon.
It has been my pleasure. And anytime I can spend with you, it makes my day, John. It's been great.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Me.
All right, everybody. We'll see you next time on the Bosshole Chronicles. We'd like to thank our guests today on the Bosshole Chronicles. And if you have a Bosshole Chronicles story of your own, please email us at mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. Once again, mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. We'll see you again soon.